Hello and welcome to LawPod. I'm Marion Hill and I'm a second-year undergraduate law student.
And I'm Mary O'Neill, a third-year law and politics undergraduate.
This week we want to talk about psychology, emotion and the law. How are the three elements connected? Does emotion permeate the substance of the law, and if so, how? And what is the link between law and behaviour?
To gain a better insight, we are speaking with Dr. Martin Reagan, a senior lecturer here at Queen's, who has conducted research on the role of emotion and psychology within the law. Dr. Reagan, welcome to LawPod and thank you for joining us today. So, Dr. Reagan, what made you want to study law post-psychology? And what's your perspective on how the two intertwine?
That's a great question. I did psychology initially as my undergraduate and my PhD. And it was quite a while then before I turned to the law. It was quite a few years afterwards. And I guess one of the things that attracted me to the law was that it seemed to me to be about behaviour, what people are doing and the rules of that. And also psychology is about the scientific study of behaviour. So I could see there was a connection there, but I also felt that in relation to the sorts of things I was interested in psychology, which were emotion, I did my PhD in the area of emotion and how the brain processes emotional information. And then I saw that when I looked at Queen's, I was just very curious about what was happening at my old university. I could see that there were people in this school who were doing research on emotion, like Professor Heather Conway and Dr. John Stannard. And I felt there's clearly not just me who thinks this is an important connection. So I felt very much that doing law after a career in psychology was a different side of the same coin in some ways. Psychology is all about the scientific study of human behaviour and thought, and that includes emotion. Emotion's part of it, it's not all of it. There's a part of psychology that overlaps with criminal law, for example. The forensic psychologist is a type of expert who is able to provide detailed evidence on the psychological state of an individual, and that can influence things like the sentencing for that individual or the treatment of that individual. So even within the law itself, there's a role for psychology in terms of at that stage in the criminal justice process, for example. And then the other side of it is that, as I mentioned, law is all about what are the rules of behaviour as between either the individual and the state or as between private individuals. So we have different areas of law. You've got public law, which is about you and the state. Criminal law, again, about certain things you're not allowed to do. So certain behaviours that are prohibited. And then in private law, you've got things like contract, torts, land law, which is all about how individuals govern the relationships between each other. So to me, there's a really obvious link between law and psychology because they're both about behaviour. And one of the key individuals in this area, Bruce Winnick, who's worked in the area of therapeutic jurisprudence, has used this term that law is a branch of applied psychology. So if psychology is the sort of scientific aspect of this, law is the sort of application of that.
What would you say about people when they view the law as an emotionally sterile realm?
It's a natural inclination to see it in that way because we're brought up to believe that there are clear laws and rules of behaviour, and we don't think of this as something that is to do with emotion or psychology. I tried to persuade my daughter to consider doing the graduate diploma in law after her first degree, and then she looked at the prospectus for whichever institution it wasn't here, and she thought this looks really boring. It looks really like sterile and not interesting at all. But to me it was very interesting because I could see that it was all about behaviour between individuals. So I think people may see it as emotionally sterile, but I think that raises another question. Is it and should it be? Is it emotionally sterile? I don't think so. Not really. Should it be? Well, you could argue that in different contexts, maybe you don't want emotion to have a strong role, but in other contexts, it inevitably will have a role. So if you're talking about a jury, for example, juries are very much influenced by graphic evidence, and the attorneys in court will use emotive techniques to persuade a jury. So they're using psychology. I don't think it is an emotionally sterile domain at all.
When we come to those high profile cases, instances where we don't want it to be emotionally sterile because they want to have as many people as interested as possible. So the lawyers are aware of that and perhaps playing into what the public are seeing at home.
I think that's almost entertainment in a way. It's not the sort of thing that I focus on. I'm interested more in the psychological aspects that are important, say in a courtroom, the behaviour of the jury, the judges, eyewitnesses, that type of thing. The use of emotion in court by those who have a stake in it. But of course, if it's turned into something that's for entertainment purposes, if it's televised, that's a whole other realm of activity.
Dr. Reagan, would you agree then that emotion can influence the law and vice versa?
In a word, yes. I mean, if we look at Terry Maroney's taxonomy of law and emotion, there are different ways in which law and emotion interact. So, for example, there are emotive components. There's emotive language in some statutory provisions. So that's an example of emotion actually being in the law. So when you talk about things like coercive control, causing emotional distress, that is actually putting emotional terminology within the law itself. It's reflecting the fact that, for example, in cases of domestic abuse, that it's not all about hitting somebody. It's also other forms of harm, like emotional harm. So if you think back to some early cases in torts, like the Wilkinson and Downton case, that's all about causing nervous shock. So it's about causing some sort of emotional harm as well. So emotion influences the law to the extent that there is emotive terminology that is part of the law. And then the law can influence emotion as well, because people may be outraged about certain provisions of the law in terms of how they affect them. So, for example, I was on a demonstration a few years ago now, which was about pro-choice, and there was a counter-demonstration which was pro-life. And clearly, these things were about how the law was going to be influenced. So the law here at that time was very restrictive in that area, and therefore that provoked a lot of emotional response in people. But it provoked it in a way that it made them coalesce around a campaign. And of course, then that produced a response by those on the other side, equally emotive response that didn't want the law changed. So the way the laws are set up, or the way the law operates, affects your emotion, and emotional behaviour can influence the law, can influence changes in the law. If we take an example, it isn't to do with things as obvious as that, where it's a very emotive topic. If someone is creating a trust for a child who's a beneficiary, well, that might be an emotive thing to do as well, because you're the person who's responsible for that property, but you're giving away the benefit of it to someone else. And therefore, emotion doesn't just pervade areas of law that are the obvious ones, like crime or emotive responses to people who kill children, for example, or campaigns to change the law on gay rights or abortion, or all of those things. It operates at lots of different places as well. For example, if I have a right to light in my home, that I can see the sunlight coming in, and somebody's building a fence in their garden to stop, I can't see that anymore. Well, I can have some recourse to the law there, because clearly that right to light must in some way be connected, it seems to me, to your enjoyment of life. So even there's an aspect to do with emotion. And it just speaks to me about this whole thing that you have a complex intertwining of behaviour and law. So to me, even if not to my daughter, having an interest in one seems to me to go along with having an interest in the other.
So from a psychological perspective, who are the key legal actors in your mind?
The key legal actors, well, I suppose if you look at authors like Terry Maroney or Susan Bandes as well, and if you look through your archive here, you will find an interview that I conducted with Professor Susan Bandes in October 2018, and on her book called The Passions of Law. And it was all about the links between law and emotion. But in terms of legal actors, it could really be everybody. So in my module in law and psychology, we don't have time to go into detail with all of those legal actors, but there's some that I do focus on, like the jury, like the judges, eyewitnesses, forensic psychologists as well. But, obviously the defendant or the parties are also the legal actors as well. And society is too, the society at large. So when you have, for example, high profile murders like Alicia Butte, the child who was murdered a few years ago. Public is very invested in that. They are a legal actor. They want an outcome. Yeah. The judge has to reflect that in what they say. So everybody's a legal actor in that sort of case, or Parliament is a legal actor. So we don't cover that in the court, but Parliament, they make the laws. Yeah. And therefore they are legal actors as well. So it's really everybody who operates within the court system, legislators, claimants, victims, the public, and as I keep trying to tell my students are legal actors as well, because they're the people who are going to shape the law in the future. So anybody who might be affected by the law, which is everybody, or influence it, which is a smaller number of people, or who operate in key roles within the law, are legal actors.
I was wondering if I could touch on barristers for a moment. A few years ago, my brother had bought me one of the books of The Secret Barrister.
Oh, yeah.
Don't know if you've ever read them. How dangerous do you think egos can be?
How dangerous do I think egos? Well, I've known a few barristers in my time, and they all have struck me, quite a lot of them, as very confident people. And I guess there's a fine line between confidence and arrogance, perhaps, in some ways, but it might be that a certain amount of that characteristic is required. In psychological terms, you would think of people as being extrovert and also very low in anxiety. Those are the sort of people who are good at performative stuff like that. Yeah. And I guess if you're operating in court, especially in our adversarial type system, it is all about performance, persuasion, whether it's trying to persuade the judge or the jury, the public. So I guess it comes with the territory. You might have individuals who are a bit like that, but there is a sort of confidence that maybe is a slightly different thing from other people, but I'm not an expert in that area.
So sort of switching the questions slightly and focusing more on court cases, do you think that people place too much faith in eyewitness testimonies?
So eyewitness testimony it's a very powerful thing in terms of what people think about it. In my module, in my course, we do a little bit of basic psychology about emotion and how people process emotional information, and the fact that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that people are very attuned to negative stimuli. They will remember them. So whenever we're getting students to do surveys and things like that, I'm saying to my colleagues, if we all do all these great things, that's fine. But if we're doing something wrong, that's what they'll remember and that's what they'll tell us about. Yeah. So emotional events are very powerful in your memory, and unpleasant ones are particularly powerful in your memory. And of course, if you're listening to an eyewitness, it's very persuasive. It's very persuasive that they are convinced about what they're telling you. They've seen or heard something and they're telling you that. And there's evidence to suggest that juries are very persuaded by that. Yeah, they're very persuaded by the eyewitness. However, the research indicates that eyewitness testimony is very unreliable. And there's misremembering, there's hindsight bias, there's lots of cognitive biases at work, confirmatory bias where people remember things as they want to remember them. And also the effect of emotion. If you're in a very stressful situation and something happens, your attention might narrow to that thing, but there's lots of other stuff going on around you and you might not remember everything correctly. Yeah. So it's powerful as a persuasive thing because we like narratives. Juries like stories. We like to hear a story. It's not as interesting to have a sample of DNA. Yeah. But the DNA sample is more or less confirmatory. Yeah. As are other forms of evidence as well. So, I mean, even something like lie detection is sort of more reliable than eyewitnesses. So there's a problem with eyewitness testimony. I always tell this story, and it's quite strange in a way. Whenever we had the old police station here on Donegal Pass, and I was a student at the time, and I was walking down the street, and a police officer said to me, do you mind taking part in an ID parade? And I thought, okay then. And he said to me, well, because you're similar size and build to the So we just want to get people in who are like that. So I went in, there were other guys like me, sort of tall, dark hair, and we were all standing there. And then they brought the suspect in, who was about 5'5" skinhead. Yeah. And of course, they didn't pick me, let's put it that way, yeah. And I presume they picked him. So in that case, maybe that was the right choice, yeah. But did you ever watch the movie 12 Angry Men? Well, now it has been remade as a stage play called 12 Angry Women as well.
Right, okay.
But in the movie, it was all hung on the eyewitness. And of course, being a movie with a message, which it was, they were able to show why this eyewitness was incorrect, yeah, in what they'd seen. But that might not always happen.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, juries, being humans, are very persuaded by good stories. If it sounds plausible, somebody says they saw this, the jury might believe that, but it might be very unreliable evidence.
You'd sort of apply the same rule to character evidence. It could be unreliable. If there is no eyewitness, you're relying on someone to tell you who this person is in your everyday life.
Yeah, that's true.
Many years ago, my father had to be a character witness. There were no eyewitnesses to the event, and my father had to come in, even though my father never saw anything.
It's not a very strong form of evidence. I mean, that's even worse in some ways because you're not even there to see anything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And of course, it's only evidence of your opinion of someone. It's not really evidence of anything actually real. It's just your opinion of a person.
So, should judges and juries be influenced by their emotion? They're told to be impartial and to only look at the evidence presented before them.
Well, this is very interesting, this question. On the part about the judges, I know that my colleague, Professor Conway, has written about judicial disgust and anger, and there are instances often where judges will use very emotive language, like in the case of little Alicia, where the judge was very strong in his condemnation of the perpetrator and used very emotive terminology. And my question to myself at the time was, that could be felt emotion, that could be how that judge feels, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Or, not that they don't feel it, but they're saying it because of this importance to society, so that society feels better, that it feels that justice has been done. So I'm not saying the judge would pretend to be emotional about things, but I'm saying that they have a role as well in reassuring society that this terrible thing is being dealt with, and the state empathizes, and the state understands, and the state shares the disgust that others have expressed as well. I guess what I would argue more is that, because there is this other image, isn't there? The judge is not emotional, the judge is this sterile image of the law. But maybe it's more about training in emotional intelligence, because we can say all we like that the judge should be impartial, and of course they should be impartial, but unemotional, and we should say that. But that presupposes that just by saying that it's true, and it's not necessarily true, because again, as a psychologist, knowing something about human behavior, that we are all influenced by things that we are not aware of. Okay, so a very small proportion of information that enters your brain is information that you are paying attention to. We would not have the resources to pay attention to everything. So a lot of things do not receive our conscious attention, but they do receive processing. Yeah, so to give you an example, and again, this is something else I sort of talk to my students about. My work used to be on people who had a fear of animals, like snakes and spiders and things like that. And I would record how their brain responded to that type of stimulus. Well, what happens is, if you present something like that to someone, like in a picture, but you do it for a very, very short time, like say 50 milliseconds or something very short, so that the person will not actually report having seen it, their body will have responded to it anyway. Yeah, so there's a type of response called the galvanic skin response, which is basically sweat response. They'll respond differently if they've been exposed to that sort of stimulus than if they've been exposed to something not particularly interesting, like the picture of a house or something like that. Yeah. So they'll respond differently to dangerous or emotive events than to neutral type everyday things. So the point about that, you're thinking, well, what's this got to do with the judge or the jury? Is that it's much better to recognize that an individual is human and their emotions are influenced by what they see, hear, smell, touch, everything else. And therefore, if you want to know how that's working and so that they are still behaving in a professional manner, it would be best, instead of denying the existence of that, to actually engage in some sort of investigation of it or some sort of training in emotional intelligence so that judges can manage their emotions. Yeah.
I see. That's very interesting. I watch quite a number of legal YouTubers. They're largely in America, but watching these televised public cases, the YouTuber would comment on, "Oh, the judge looks angry.
Yeah.
Oh, they look nervous. Oh, they look pretty happy." Is that something that you focus on in your module, Law and Psychology, or is that separate to your own research?
I would be interested in that. I would be interested in expressions of emotion by judges, going back to the point earlier as to whether that is serving a societal purpose or whether it's real. Yeah, I'm sure sometimes it is real. And then you would ask, well, is it appropriate? Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
And then you would say, well, maybe it is in some cases and maybe it isn't. But it's something we can't ignore because with everyday behavior with individuals, emotion is influenced by everything that you experience. And we can't pretend that somehow judges have switched that off because you can't consciously switch it off.
I suppose perhaps if that becomes a growing trend, there are even other YouTube channels called the Behavioral Arts who watch and they will tell you this is masking, this is a twitch, that's what this means. Do you think the judiciary, the judges and lawyers will have to start going through additional training to be taught is how you've really got to keep a straight face and don't give anything away?
They might have to, or maybe we shouldn't be televising all of this, but that's another question.
That's predominantly in America. Now in the UK, we televise the sentencing.
Yes.
And that's about as much as they show in the UK. Can you see a day when the courts will be fully open in the UK?
It's not something that I'm in favour of. It might happen, but it's not something that I would be in favour of. I think when we hear judgments of the Supreme Court, we see them as well, don't we, sometimes? So that's fine. But I guess that's at the point where everything's been decided, you know? And so at that point, it's not going to be detrimental to the process if there's that sort of, as you say, in the sentencing or the broadcast of a Supreme Court judgment.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think that's all the questions that we have for you today.
Yeah,
Dr.
it is
Reagan.
actually.
Thank you very much for talking to us.
I'm very pleased that you invited me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
It's my first time in this studio for quite a few years now. But yeah.
Yes,
thank you very much.
You were in the hot seat this time. You were the interviewer on a previous episode. And
that was really bizarre because I had been here a month, right? I just arrived.
Oh, really?
And it was Heather that had invited Professor Bandy's over. And her and Dr. Stannard had some events with her. And Heather just said to me, will you do the interview? And I thought, oh, okay then. And it was like, yeah, it was quite difficult. But all that stuff about the actors is very interesting because there's a couple of special editions. There's a special edition of NILQ from a few years ago, which is part of the reading for my module, which is all about law and emotion in different contexts. And it's really interesting because they've got papers about things like remorse as well. So sometimes you'll see defendants who look impassive and they're not saying or doing anything. And that's really perceived quite negatively.
Yes.
Yeah? That they're heartless and they don't care and all of that stuff. And maybe they've just been told just to sit and be quiet. But maybe that's not real.
I recall that a lot with Jeffrey Dahmer when he was on trial, who just sat there as if he's made of stone. And even when the witness statements were being done by the family members of those who he had killed. Yes. And some of these people were incredibly emotional. One lady was even riling around the courtroom trying to attack him. And he just, no reaction whatsoever. It was fascinating.
That could be a different category as well, because one of the other, we keep going back to crime because it's the easy, obvious one, Although I think psychology permeates every aspect of law, but crime is the obvious one that people say, oh yeah. But things like studying psychopathy and psychopathic antisocial behaviour, that's clearly of huge interest to forensic psychologists in terms of certain individuals' inability to regulate their emotional responses, And it's also of interest to the criminal justice area as well, because those sort of people, should they be treated differently than individuals who don't have those issues or not? So in that area, even just alone, there's a huge overlap. And we didn't really get to talk about the juries that much.
Get a little bit more if you want.
I just said a little bit about the juries because you did ask about judges and juries, and then I didn't say anything about the jury. Juries are very interesting. You're too young to remember that for many years here in this jurisdiction, there were no juries because of the conflict. And there's still certain types of trial in which there isn't a jury. There are also certain jurisdictions around the world that don't have a jury trial. And there are people on both sides who think, A, we should have juries or we shouldn't have them. And that's of interest to me as well, because I'm interested in what juries do and how they operate. Now, if you looked back to the movie 12 Angry Men, that was a sort of study in group influence and how people are influenced in a group. In my module, I do a lot of group work, and part of that is about social influence as well. So if you think people are very much influenced within a group, you might think, oh, that's a reason not to have a jury, because you don't want that. You don't want people being unduly influenced by other people. And with the added danger that due to the Contempt of Court Act, we can't actually ask juries what they were doing in the jury room. Anyway, afterwards, you can't do research in this country on real juries. You do mock jury experiments, but you can't ask them what they were doing. So there's a lot of mystery there about what's going on in the jury. And in other jurisdictions like the US, you have companies that are employed to select and deselect members of a jury and investigate them. And it's a whole industry over there. So you think, well, why do we want a jury? It's the tradition here in our sort of common law tradition to have a jury of peers.
Yes.
But psychologically, it could be problematic. It's certainly interesting though, because you think, well, how do they reach a decision? How does an individual juror reach a decision? Well, it goes back to this point earlier when you asked about eyewitness testimony. They like stories. And so if there's a narrative, jurors will like a narrative, and there's a model of jury behaviour called the story model by Pennington and Hastie, and it's all about how jurors will match what they know with what the story is and to produce their decision about what's happened. Yeah. So if we think we should have juries, then I think it's very important to have some understanding as to how they operate. Even if we can't do certain types of research, we need to understand a bit about how they operate. If you take the view that we shouldn't have them, that's a different point of view. Some people argue that if it's a judge-only trial, at least you do get the reasoning for the verdict. Yeah, so that's available, but that's not available with a jury.
Yes.
So psychologically, juries are very interesting because they're influenced by evidence. Some of that evidence is not as reliable as other forms of evidence, and they're influenced by each other as well. And we need to know both the positive and the negative ways in which that influence could work.
It's very interesting. I know that at the moment with the latest attempt at trying to bring Donald Trump to court, they're struggling to find a jury of impartial jurors, and we can't be told what side they're on, what they're thinking. Yeah,
well, that goes back to the point about jury selection in the US. If you might deselect a juror because you think they're not going to be able to give an unbiased evaluation of the situation, but of course with somebody so high profile, everybody knows who they are. So that is a problem, isn't it?
And so on the other side, it was during the O.J. Simpson trial, what was it, 6 months? The jury was kept being moved from hotel to hotel. They couldn't go home. They couldn't read the newspaper. They couldn't watch TV. They became prisoners.
Yeah.
And that's another factor to take into account, that we can't use these people too far.
And especially now with social media and increased ability to communicate wherever you are.
Yes.
It's very difficult to isolate a group of people like that, or individually even. I mean, it's just hard to do that so that they're not connected with the outside world in some way.
Sort of going off that, do you think or do you believe in the future that juries will be reformed? Obviously, there's so much things that have come into play now that are going to influence emotion and influence how people view cases, especially high profile cases. So do you sort of believe that juries should be reformed, or there should be different things put into place.
What type of reform are you thinking of?
I don't really know the type of sort of
Okay.
reforms, because obviously it's not really, nothing's really happened yet, but like different things obviously to sort of stop them sort of outside influences, because obviously looking back 30 years ago it was different and the world's sort of changing now.
Yeah, it's really, I'm not sure how best to reform. I mean, I guess if we understand more about how people make those sorts of decisions in jury room, that would be useful, but we can't do that in real cases. I'm on the fence really as to how useful it is to have a jury or whether to have a judge-based trial. Depends on the sort of case it is. I guess if it's something that's less emotive, then that's probably less problematic. If it isn't, so we're saying everything's emotive potentially, or everything involves psychology and behaviour, but there are certain sorts of cases that do not elicit strong emotions, like white collar crime, for example, or that type of thing, or those sorts of disputes. So I'm not sure really. I'd have to think about can they be reformed?
Yeah,
I'm not sure, because if you start interfering with what a jury is meant to be, then have you undermined the whole idea of a jury being your peers? Are you influencing it unduly?